Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now cast your mind back, all the way back to the year 2000, when Codex Armageddon and the Armageddon Worldwide campaign took place in Games Workshop and gaming clubs all around the world. It was the first major gaming event that I got involved with, and it was really cool. In particular because it saw the release of the Steel Legion miniatures, which were awesome. Now, one of the funny things that happened as a result is that one of the very first glimpses of a Death Korps miniature we saw was actually a Steel Legion figure which had been painted with a skull mask. So, to my mind, there's a nice poetic circle happening here where this time we're going to paint Steel Legion by using Death Korps miniatures. So thank you very much to Kutami for supplying the plastic Krieg necessary to actually do this video in the first place. They're an online store which you can cruise along to, pick up some tabletop miniatures and games at a bit of a discount, and they ship all around the EU, which, as I've mentioned before, does still include the UK, though customs charges may apply, so keep your eyes open there. As always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So to begin with, I've hit this guy with a primer of Desert Yellow from Vallejo, but there's no reason you couldn't use Xandri Dust here instead. I'm using this because I think that little touch of yellow to our primer is going to help with this next stage, and that's going to be to start by painting his jacket. Now for this I've got Zamesi Desert, and this is quite, you see a lot of painting guides these days, they go for straight Xandri Dust on the jackets, but at the risk of sounding like an old fart, I remember when Steel Legion were yellow. They had a very yellow tint to their jackets. You'll see this goes on fairly easily. What I would suggest is that once you've put on one coat, because this is a layer paint, you're going to want to come back and just see whether or not it needs a second one. Now, even though I'm using the yellow primer, I did put 2 coats of that on, and I think it looks a little better overall. What I've got now is one of my little dry brushes. This is one of the makeup brushes I like to use for this, and I've mixed in a little bit of Tyrant Skull to it. What I've done is scrubbed most of that off onto a bit of kitchen towel, you'll see in the corner there. And what I'm going to do is just lightly flick repeatedly over the same spot and slowly pick out some of these details that I want to highlight. So this is not going to be a final highlight, like we can come back later and add a little bit more of this. But this is a really easy way to pick out some of the details on the coat itself. I'm actually going to need a little bit more paint there, hang on a tick. That's more like it. Yeah, we can use this to pick out some details without having to be too careful about it, and we don't have to worry about whether or not we can paint a straight line. Now, if you want to come back later and highlight, the other bonus to this too is that the dry brush is going to give you essentially a guide on where that should look best. So take your time now, and you can be quite generous with it in some areas, like towards edges and similar. But a few passes, build up the colour slowly, and you'll get a much more natural result than just blasting it on one big smudge. Once you've gone around there a couple of times, you'll start to notice that colour building up, and then we have some nice volume without having to muck around painting straight lines. Dry brushing is something you definitely want to practice. We'll move on now. I have some Mechanicus Standard Grey, and we're going to paint in his trousers. And one other detail that we're going to have to sort of invent here, because the original Steel Legion, they don't have these backpacks. So in order that his trousers and this bedroll thing on his pack here sort of look like they belong to the same dude, I'm going to paint both of these in grey. Now once you're satisfied with that, we're going to move on and actually paint in his eyes here. Reason being, we can use the rest of his mask as sort of a tidy up stage. So I'm going to get a little bit of black here and a nice fine brush, but I'm not terribly concerned about how much of a mess I make here. So let's just block in the eye sockets. Now from here, this is a lot more difficult with a camera in the way. What I'm going to do is to lightly edge towards the eye sockets, but I'm not worried if I hit the mask, you see. All that's important is that I leave the black recesses in the eye intact, and I can make quite a mess on the face and it won't matter because we're going to tidy that up in just a second. And with both of those done, you'll probably find it easier at this stage to carry on painting the rest of the metallic details. So I'm going to stick to my Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to pick out areas like the respirator box on his chest here. Again, not being terribly careful over areas that I know are going to be brown later. You can paint in his las gun with this, basically anything that's going to be silver later. Now you'll be able to reach almost all of the details that will be silver now, but there are one or two areas which are going to be impractical to do now, like this little section on the front of his mask. We're going to have to paint that after we paint in the mask itself. So we're going to move to that now. What I've got is German Camo Black Brown from Vallejo. Now this sits sort of just between Dryad Bark and Rhinox Hide. And if you were going to stick to Citadel, I would recommend that Dryad Bark is probably the better choice here. We're going to use this to paint in all of the leather details. And you'll see here why we've done the silver first for the most part, in that it covers very well. And any areas that we've gone a little bit too keen with the silver, we can tidy up some of that with our leather now. So his gloves, and importantly his mask actually. Let's just flick to that for a second. Because here you see the beauty of doing the eyes first. You can tidy this up very quickly. Now if there's any one point which is going to be the time-consuming one, it's that brown. Reason being, you do want to be quite careful as you're going around the miniature. All of the yellow that we've painted you want to try and avoid. Though if you do make any mistakes, I certainly did on the back of his collar here, a little bit of Zamesi Desert over the top of that will fix that problem, not to worry. We're going to move on now to Eshin Grey, and I'm using this because the actual, like the old Steel Legion guys used to have knee-high boots. But if we just paint the puttees in black, they're going to blend in with the boots and they won't look quite right. So I'm going to do these in a dark grey, just off black once it dries. And I'm also going to do the handle on the entrenching tool here, any sort of soft black. So I'm also going to paint in the hose on his respirator with this. That will definitely take 2 coats to get a nice solid color, but you'll see it's just off black, and when we shade it, it's going to look much darker. It's going to visually tie in those boots, I think. Now speaking of the boots, I've turned to Vallejo's flat black, and I'm using this because the coverage is much better than Abaddon black. So I'm going to paint in his boots with this, and I'm also going to paint in all of the hard black details. So at this point, we're going to start filling in his armor. You might want to slow down a little compared to what I'm doing here, because I just noticed how quickly I came close to disaster. As well, any of the little details that you've added on the miniature, like this, what is this, mess tin hanging from his pack here, you can paint these in now as well. Now ordinarily it's at this stage where finally he starts to look about right. Now what I'm going to do is go back to my brown and my silver, because there are a few areas that I want to tidy up. Just little touch-ups I want to make on his gun, for example. And I'm also going to switch to a smaller brush and paint in this little doufler on the front of his mask here. Once you've gone around and done your last few stages of tidy up, including any buttons that you want to paint in, I find it's easiest to paint them with just a little dot of silver now, because a shade is going to help tie them in. So any last straps and what have you I've done, and there is one last detail to decide how you want to paint. The little eagle on the front of his helmet. Now the original Steel Legion didn't have this, but they did have white markings on their jackets, and to me I think white is going to stand out nicely against all of the rest of the dark colours of his armour. So I have a little bit of white scar, and I'm going to do just a couple of quick coats of this. Oopsie daisy. The bonus being that if I make a mistake here, the black is really easy to tidy up. So yeah, I'm not too worried if I do make a mess. Just a couple of coats of white. Oh geez, I am really messing that up. Okay, so after any final cleanup, we can move on to our shade. And I'm going to use Agrax Earthshade for the whole thing. Now, same as always, I've given this a really good shake. And a common question is, what do I do if my shade comes out shiny? Well, ordinarily, shake it a bit more before you use it, or double check that Citadel hasn't slipped you a gloss varnish. I know there are a couple of painting sets which have Agrax Earthshade gloss as their sort of standard, and I don't know why that is. So I've loaded up my medium shade brush here, and I'm going to apply this fairly generously across the whole miniature. Make sure that you are working it into any recesses. And yeah, if you get it pooling on big flat areas like this, just move it away. You don't want quite that much in that sort of spot. So while it's still wet, you've got quite a lot of chance to work with it. And yeah, let's go. I'm going to cover the whole dude in Agrax Earthshade and then give him about half an hour to dry. And once that's had plenty of time to dry, this is what you'll have. And as always, I'm fond of pointing out, if you're painting a huge guard army with tons of infantry, why not just base them up, call them done? There's not a reason that you couldn't put an army like this on the table, and they would look brilliant. But as always, well, why stop here? You know, we can take it a little further, and particularly for your officers and such, maybe you do want a slightly nicer finish. So we're going to do just a couple of highlights, and I will start off with Dawnstone here. We're going to highlight the grey on his trousers and his, I want to say, bedroll. So what we'll do is, once I've added a little bit of water to this, is to paint over most of the trousers again in Dawnstone. But what I want to do is leave the shaded Mechanicus standard grey in the recesses. So there's a little bit of style decision to be made here about how far you want to leave that darker grey and how close do you want the light grey to go, but it is up to you. So this sort of look, I think, is going to be fine. Now you can see I've painted in the majority of the trousers and the roll here, leaving just a little bit of the Mechanicus standard grey in the recesses. Reason being because we're actually going to highlight this a second time in a moment. But first, while you've got your Dawnstone out, get yourself a nice small brush, and what I'm going to do is work off most of it, and then just using the edge of the brush, I'm going to flick along some of the edges of the gun itself. Now his armor we are going to paint a different way, but as a way of quickly highlighting the weapon, while you've got your Dawnstone, you may as well. Now particularly on his weapon, don't worry too much if you do make any mistakes. If your highlights are too thick or similar, what you can do is just go straight back to your black and paint over those areas where you want to thin them out again. So what I have now, this is a little Administratum Grey, and like I said, we ordinarily wouldn't go this far for ordinary guardsmen, but why not? I'm having fun, and I think it's always worth trying now and then just to go a little further than usual. So I'm going to add just some tiny wee flicks of this, and I tend to find making small flicking motions where I want the highlight to be, and slowly moving my hand towards the area is generally the easiest way of getting a nice sharp line. Now from here we're going to turn to another grey, and I'm using Stormvermin Fur. We're going to highlight the black armor here. Now I get asked quite a bit, how is it that you maintain control of a brush? The short answer is have less paint on your brush. Part of the reason why we thin paint down is so that it flows off a brush very easily. So you'll notice if I get a shot here, I haven't actually got much on the tip of my brush at all. Because when I touch it to the miniature, I want it to flow away very easily without having to sort of fight with it. You'll also find that paint which is thinned down a bit will dry slightly darker than it appears when it's going on. So now we're going to go around the whole model, and following that same method, just paint some little tiny lines on the edges of the black detail. Now because I am mortal, I did come back with a little bit of black and actually straighten out the highlight that I'd made, a bit of a pig's ear back there. What I've got now is Gorthor Brown, and we're going to do the same thing to all of the leather details. So as always, just a tiny wee bit of paint on your brush, and I'm going to dab the back of his knuckles first of all, and paint his fingers in the same way. And when it comes to highlighting the mask, I thoroughly suggest don't worry about doing too much to it. All you want to really accentuate the shape of this face is that little cheekbone section just here. And a tiny wee line of this will be plenty for that. Now I do suggest as well any areas of the pack, the respirator pack on his chest that you can see, do highlight the edge of those, but don't worry too much about, right up under there. It's not going to matter. I'm going to move on now, and I have Ushabti Bone, but I'm actually using the air version of this. I tend to find if there is an air paint version of a color, it makes a really smooth highlight. So what I'm going to do is, same as everything else we have so far, just pick some areas where I really want a sharp line and go over it a couple of times with this Ushabti Bone. You can be quite sparing with this because our highlight has already been done by the dry brush, but this is good if you want a really crisp edge along some areas, particularly between areas of detail which are different colors. Now, as well as the Ushabti Bone, I went back to my white and I've just dotted in a little of the eagle there. But there is one last detail where, if you want to, I think this looks kind of cool, so I'm going to do it now. I have some Nuln Oil and we're going to go over the weapon again. So this is going to dull this down quite a bit. And then once again to Iron Hand Steel, using quite a lot of that today. You can use this to highlight the base color because we've shaded it twice, so it's going to be quite a lot darker than this. Now, I quite often see it said that there is a bit of a green tint to the armor of the Steel Legion. What I'd suggest at this point, if you do want to do that, because we've highlighted the armor in a grey color, go over it with a little bit of a Thonian camo shade over those black areas. That will green it up quite enough. I personally have never really noticed it, but some people insist that that's more accurate, so up to you if you do want to go that route. What I'm going to do now is to varnish this, and because it's a horrible dreary day outside, I can't spray it. What I'm going to use instead, this is Instar Varnish Plus. Now these guys are based in England, so if you are, local to the area, you'll probably find it much easier to get your hands on this at the moment. I do thoroughly recommend this as a really good varnish. What I'm going to do is grab my brush, load this bad boy up, and we'll just start applying this over the whole miniature. Now do be careful when applying that you don't let it collect in any big white globs in the recesses. But once it's dried, you get a beautiful matte finish. It's really very nice. You'll also find that it does accentuate some of those highlights again, so if you're worried about them not standing out, just give it a varnish with that Varnish Plus. Really good stuff. So what I'm going to do now is pop a base on him, and let's get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished. So there at last, our Steel Corps Death Legionnaire, whatever you want to call him, is complete, and I'm actually really pleased with that result. In particular, I think starting from a yellowish primer is going to give you a much easier result to get that classic yellow look to your Steel Legion jackets. So this is an incredibly simple conversion to do. All you need is a couple of seconds with a pair of clippers just to knock the vent off the top of the helmet, and then a few seconds more with your knife to trim it all down and smooth it flat so you get that slightly more Steel Legion finish to the helmet. Really, really simple, very quick to do. So once again, thank you to Kutami for supplying the Steel Legion, rather the Death Korps, necessary to do this video, as well as all of the lovely patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. And if you do happen to end up doing something like this, make sure you tag me on Instagram so that I get to see it, because I love knowing when people are using these guides out in the wild. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.